Hey guys, I know a lot of you were hoping that Dark Sun was going to be the next 5th edition setting, but I might have found a book that's honestly the next best thing. Welcome to the GM's table. If you know, slightly new look, but let's get on with the review. So, as I said, I may have found a book that's a really good replacement or supplement to do Dark Sun for D&D 5e, and I'm not joking about that. It's this: Ravaged Wastelands of Crifoth. I can't really do the F to TH, and I have it on PDF. It does say Ravaged Wastelands up there. But here's the deal with it. Okay? This is a desert, a post-apocalyptic fantasy setting, which means this is going to cover harsh desert post-apocalyptic environments. It's going to cover survival heavily, but there's still a fantasy flavor. I'm gonna be honest, it is not exactly Dark Sun. The two big things that aren't here is there aren't your sorcerer kings. Instead, they are basically replaced with archdemons, which I'm going to get into in one of my 5 reasons why I love this book. And there isn't the very iconic Dark Sun mechanic of if you cast too much magic, you can draw the life around you, kill things around you for magical power. That's not here. If that is one of the key components to Dark Sun you absolutely need, you need to find a way to add it in, which really isn't that hard. It means you just take a little bit of homebrew rather than someone's complete homebrew and plug it in, or you live without it. For me, I'm fine with living without because they add enough in here where it's still going to feel very deadly, dark, and dangerous. They describe this game as this is a game of survivors, not heroes. And that very much flavors this world. So with that, I'm going to jump into the 5 reasons I think this book is worth having, and then the downsides at the end, which there aren't a ton, but I want to save them for the end just so we can get the good stuff right up front. So first thing we're going to cover are the races. Now, I want to be upfront, as far as this game's concerned, classic elves, classic dwarves, halflings, all of those races don't exist anymore. They're all dead. Humans still exist. We're going to get into what makes them interesting and unique down in this list. But we're going to start out with the Ash Elves. So the Ash Elves are the last elves left, and they're a completely different type of elves. They share some of the same characteristics, but the main thing of their backstory is all the other elves basically got the heck out of Dodge when the world started more or less being destroyed. These are the elves that remain. Now they're cut off. They're no longer immortal, which the elves they were related to are. But their biggest advantage is they can survive the heat of the desert. In fact, they can survive what's called the kilning, which happens once per day when the 2 suns, because this world has 2 suns now, kind of meet in the sky and things become so hot, everything gets more or less destroyed or at least badly hurt. Ash Elves, they can just take it. They don't care about it. That's their big deal. Moving on from that, we have what they call the Incarnum, which are essentially elementals. You are an avatar made by the elementals in response to these demonic threats, trying to bring balance back to the world. In their own lore, it's very interesting because this is a race that doesn't have a childhood. They're made. They just kind of show up. But they also only live about 10 years. Now you have 3 options with them. You have the Stormborn, which represent water and wind, and they only need a strong breeze to count as basically like food and water for the day. You have the Cinderborn, which are fire and burnt embers, and all they need is a flame to consume per day, which is really useful in this world of everything's on fire. And then you have the Dustborn, which are these big, almost like golems of rock and dirt. And they're these big, hulking brutes that survive off, well, as you would have guessed, rocks and dirt. So they're this really cool, interesting take. I'm showing the artwork through here because it's gorgeous art. It's very evocative of the style. Moving on from that, this is probably the biggest one for me. They have orcs in here. And some of you might be saying, well, D&D 5th edition already has orcs. The player's handbook has half orcs. Volo's guide brought in orcs. Well, I'm going to be real honest. My players hate the playable orcs in Volo's guide. I don't typically run games where they can just beat orcs, but even then they hate them, and I don't blame them. When you look at the orc in Volo's guide, and then you look at the half orc in the player's handbook, the half orc is better at doing orc things than the full orc. Yeah, the full orc has a slightly better strength bump, but still max 20. And we're talking about heroes. They're going to be, if they're the strong character, which an orc likely will be, they're going to be reaching that anyways. It doesn't really feel orcish. The orcs in this game, they are fierce. There's stuff about clans. Every orc that is a hero, which means that you're playing as, has already defeated a demon, and there's tables to generate the demon you have already vanquished, which is really, really cool. I'm not getting into all the mechanics, check out the book for that, but I will say they feel more like playing an orc, which matters a ton to me. After that, you have the Suri, which is another one of the races that actually get sub-races here, because they're essentially lizard folk and halflings, aka kobolds. But when you look at how they're built, they brought halflings back into the world and made them lizard people and made them a sub-race with the more or less lizard folk and just called them the Siri. I really like them, though. They're very interesting. They still have short lives. I believe they live to be 20 or 30 years old. They don't have a written tradition, so they're not well educated. There's a lot of great lore. I will say side tangent, because you guys know how that is. In fact, I'm going to bring my face up here. I do side tangents in my reviews. One of the things I love here is I'm not a huge fan of a ton of fluff in my books. I like enough fluff to get a good feel for the world, but not where I feel like I'm reading a book inside of the book. I don't want to get into it, but there's a setting I'm coming up to review that's taking me forever, because while I love a lot of the stuff in the game, there is 160 pages of lore and fluff before you even get to character creation. That's too far. This book, I feel like, has just enough fluff. It's like 1, maybe 2 paragraphs, and you know everything you need to know about these races. Then finally, we're back in artwork. We're on the tieflings. There's a small little, again, 1 or 2 paragraphs, story that the writers talk about how they came up with this world, because it all spurned from the idea of they wanted tieflings to be more interesting. And they gave tieflings a lot of love in this book. I think one of the most interesting things, it's its own mechanic, but I'm going to talk about here, is any human can end up becoming a tiefling by drinking demon blood. It's addictive, it has benefits, but it has drawbacks. Really cool thing, you don't necessarily immediately become a tiefling, but that's how tieflings kind of came to be, is by humans either ingesting or being heavily exposed to demons' blood, which tainted them. And then tainted tieflings can give birth to other tieflings, but that's where they came from. It's this great new bit of how the world works, and it's not just fluff, because if a human character ever ingests demon blood, they can end up becoming a tiefling, and they lose some of their human bonuses and become tieflings instead. Now, I saved humans for last, because I just wanted to talk about them a little bit. They're basically the variant human that normally comes with a feat, but you don't get a feat. Instead, in this world, humans are the last race that were fully created by the gods. They're the last connection to the gods. Essentially, the gods are more or less dead at this point. But instead of humans getting to just pick a feat, they instead have a list of divine gifts, and you get to pick what divine gift you were born with. Now, becoming a tiefling, you lose the divine gift and you gain the tiefling bonuses, which is a really nice way to handle that swap over. It doesn't create... A human that becomes a tiefling is not more powerful than a human who didn't, and isn't more powerful than a tiefling who started as one, ideally. But the option's still there, so they found a way to create game balance that fit within the world, that actually is evocative of the lore, and some great design mixed with writing that I kind of love. Number 2, we covered races, and now I want to talk about classes, because Ravaged Wasteland has some incredibly interesting takes on classes, but more importantly, especially for those of you who are sticking around of how does this work in Dark Sun? Well, here's the thing. Every single class has a write-up. It's not super long, which it doesn't need to be because it's well written and concise, but has a write-up on how every class and every class option in the player's handbook fits into a desert, mystical, post-apocalyptic wasteland, aka how you can take any of the class options from the player's handbook and make them work in a Dark Sun type world. That alone, super useful. On top of that, every single class has extra tables that kind of help you flesh out the character's background tied to that class with a more post-apocalyptic survivalist feel to it. It reminds me very much of the tables and Xanathars tied to every class. Now, not every class gets brand new class options, if you don't count the story and fluff stuff. But the ones that are there are really cool. So barbarians get the primal path, which, as you would guess, they're more savage. They're very survival driven. They're cool. They're barbarian-y. The clerics, I think, of this list I have are the standouts for me. Clerics get the domain of flesh. These are clerics who worship basically cannibalism. These are clerics who are kind of these tribal witch doctors that eventually you can literally remove the hearts of people you've defeated. And you can either use the heart to then puppet the body, or you can consume the heart to gain power as temporary buffs. That is so cool. It is so savage and violent and so fitting of the world. And I feel like it has the most flavor combined with mechanics of any of the classes. But that's not to say there isn't other cool stuff here. As I said, tieflings get a lot of love, and they get their own exclusive sorceress origin called Profane Soul, which is basically where they dip even more into the power of the demon blood that is now inside of them. Warlocks have a whole new list of otherworldly patrons. I'm not going to beat them all down, but there's really cool ones. There's one based off of just a plague called the World Plague. And then wizards get a new school. It is the School of Sigils, because sigil magic is kind of its own type of magic in this world, which is worth looking into and worth learning the ins and outs of. It's not incredibly complex, but it's there, and wizards have access to it. And it's really kind of just this fun new thing to add a little extra flavor to wizards. But like I said, the clerics are really the standouts here. Number 3. This is where we get into the real mechanics that completely change the game and make it far more of a survival game than normal 5th edition. I've been very honest and open about the fact that I actually really love the gritty realism healing rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide, which if you haven't seen, check them out. I go a little lighter on them, but the basics are 1 night's rest is a short rest, and for them, resting for a week gives you a long rest. Me, I just do once per week you can take a long rest. They go a slightly different route, and it's closer to the severity of what I do than the full severity of you need to have a week of downtime. Basically, they added another level of rest. There is now a quick rest, a short rest, and a long rest. A quick rest is your hour rest, and it lets you spend hit die. How hit die work are going to be a little different, but I'm going to cover that in a minute. But the main thing is a quick rest lets you spend hit die. A short rest is 8 hours of rest. With that 8 hours, you regain 1 level of exhaustion. Exhaustion works a little differently. Also, gonna cover that. But you regain basically 1 point of exhaustion. You regain all your short rest abilities. And to keep casters a little more playable in this, all casters regain 1 spell slot of the highest level empty spell slot they have. So if you've used your highest level slot, you regain that slot. If it was a lower level slot and you still have your highest, you regain that slot. But if you're worried casters are getting shafted, they gave casters a little bit of a catch-up bump. Then finally, long rest, you have to spend 3 days resting, and it has to be in a safe and secure location, aka a settlement, a homestead with a tribe. Somewhere where you're not out in the wilderness and out in the elements. That then counts as your long rest. Now, The other big thing is long resting does not regain back all your hit points. Instead, you regain your hit die and you regain 1 blood point. And this is where we're going to get into how hit points have completely changed in this game, and I love it. So, one of the carryaways I actually really liked from Starfinder, even though the overall game didn't really hit it with me, was their stamina system. If you've looked into Starfinder, you might already be familiar with this, where in Starfinder, characters now have hit points and they have stamina. And stamina resets quickly, hit points reset very slowly. And stamina is almost like a temporary hit point buffer. In Ravaged Wasteland, you have grit and you have blood points. Your grit is equal to your maximum hit die. So basically, every level, whatever your hit dice would be, you gain that max in grit. That's your grit. That's your buffer. Most things that deal damage will deal damage to grit. Most spells that heal either heal grit, or if it's a number of dice and stuff, there's rules in there where basically you can choose to heal half as much to heal blood points. But they talk about it in there. It's actually limited. Not every spell is going to be able to heal hit points anymore, or blood points. I'm probably just going to call them hit points. Finally, you have your blood points. I just said I'm going to call them hit points, and I call them blood points. But finally, you have your blood points. Your blood point pool is equal to your level plus your con modifier plus your strength modifier. It is a very, very small pool. But, as I said, most things are going to have to whittle down your grit before they get to your blood points. One of the things I love, once your grit's all the way gone, you actually gain basically a debuff that you have disadvantage on like all your attack rolls and all your actions. And attacks have advantage on hitting you until you have grit points back. So, being out of grit means you're really close to dead anyways. But then you're like teetering there. Somebody could just come up and take you out. The other big thing is they changed how critical hits work. And they changed it to work with this system. Rather than it being more dice and you roll higher, which that's a great system. But in this, you roll the normal damage, but it's automatically applied to blood points. This actually means things like a critical hit with a greatsword can kill relatively high-level characters in a single blow. Critical attacks are horrible and deadly, but they added mechanics with that as well. I'm not getting into the full ins and outs, but you can basically choose to take damage to your armor to turn a crit back into a normal attack. And how heavy your armor is determines how many times that can happen before your armor is completely broken and you have to spend time to repair your armor. And basically, by using the modifying crit system, they created their own opt-in degradation system for armor. And there's a similar type system for weapons. It's really, really cool. For weapons, it's essentially you choose to, if you got a critical failure, you can take damage to your weapon. I believe it just immediately just breaks your weapon, but you get a second roll to try and hit. It's this really, really cool, interesting system to add degradation into something as fluid and, I don't want to say minimalistic, because 5th edition has a lot more moving parts than a true minimalist game, but a much more minimalistic version of D&D, while keeping all that and incorporating it. It's a very elegant way to handle it. But between the grit and the blood points and this new resting rules, as I said, you regain only 1 blood point per 3 days of rest in a town. So when you take real damage, it's going to hurt. You will need that magic that can actually restore blood points. Number 4, we're getting into the survival rules. Now, if you're familiar with Adventures in Middle-earth, another third-party conversion of 5th edition that turns 5e into a Tolkien-type game, you'll know that they have journeying rules where there's basically a travel phase, and everybody takes on single duties, and typically there's more options than there are players, so you have to pick wisely on who's handling what to be able to travel. Well, in this game, in Ravaged Wastelands, they do almost the exact same thing with a survival phase. And they talk about how the survival phase can be anywhere from a few hours to a day to, for the really long games, you can cover several days per phase. And long travels, you can do multiple phases. But basically, you do a survival phase, and when the survival phase is over, is when something interesting happens. and then you go back into a survival phase, so you can move through time relatively easy without dragging it down. There's a bunch of different jobs people can do. There's a ton of options. I'm actually going to quickly glance over at the options again, because just to give you a quick idea, some survival tasks are pathfinding, gear management, which is how you repair your gear, tracking, tending to wounds, keeping vigilant, healing or hunting and foraging, gathering remedies, and you can choose to do nothing. Now, why would you choose to do nothing? Well, here's the thing. Every option other than do nothing puts a point of exhaustion on you. Yeah, doing actions adds exhaustion. Now, it's not levels of exhaustion like 5e. I said I was going to cover exhaustion. This is where I'm going to cover it. Basically, you have an exhaustion score, and you have an exhaustion threshold. Your threshold is equal to your level plus your con modifier. As long as you're under your threshold, you're actually pretty good. Once you reach your threshold, there's some pretty major debuffs, and I believe it's threshold minus 10, you die. So you want to manage how much energy you're putting into things. Now, I said, if you rest, if you do your 8-hour rest, you can regain 1 point of exhaustion. If you rest in a sheltered area in that 8-hour rest, you gain an extra point of exhaustion. Drinking a ration of water regains a point of exhaustion. Drinking a ration of food regains a point of exhaustion. This does mean as a GM, you do have to actually care about food and water rations, but this is a survival game. If you want to run it as a survival game, then you need to worry about these things. Now, on top of that, in the whole survival area, they also talk about hazards. When I say something interesting happens, it doesn't have to be an encounter. Now, it could be you come across people and have a social situation as well. But they also have, I wish they had more example hazards, but they have a whole area about talking about how to build hazards, and then they give you the example of the kindling, which I talked about, because that one's so important to the game, it has to be in here. But you just go, all right, and now there's a hazard, we have to deal with the hazard, now we get back into survival. Oh, you came across things, or you were ambushed, so now you have to worry about this. And things like keeping watch in your survival phase can prevent ambushes. It's this nice mini game to keep things tactical while trying to keep the game moving as much as possible that I think is just so well handled. It basically lets you keep a resource management survival heavy game from dragging to a halt, which, as I know personally, having run a lot of these, can happen very, very easily. Number 5, the last thing of the big bullet points I think make this game really worth it, and that's the Archfiends section. As I said, instead of Sorcerer Kings, there's Archfiends. Specifically, there's supposed to be 6 Archfiends. I'm going to be honest, there's really 5, and then they have the unknown Archfiend, which the book is very honest about. We built in the lore a way to have an Archfiend that the GM can just make up however they want. They give a lot of good tools on how to make him from scratch, as well as some great ideas. But even then, each and every Archfiend not only is big, bad, you get some great lore about them, they all have tables of different motivations and different goals that Archfiend might have right now, which means you can run these Archfiends long form. And if you're worried about, oh, what if my player's going to kill him? All the Archfiends are CR 30, okay? These aren't guys you just walk up and kill. These are essentially, I almost said 3. These are essentially 5 big bads that you can just place. You could place even 1. You can have a whole level 0 even to 20 campaign and have only 1 Archfiend ever show up. You can have a whole campaign around 1. You get 6 of them. Like I said, 5 fully fleshed, 1 kind of fleshed out with a lot of ideas and a lot of tools to make them your own. But that is really, really cool. This, again, reminds me of a book. It reminds me a lot of the new Waterdeep book that came out, where they have a bunch of big bads, and you only have to pick 1 so you can rerun the campaign multiple times with different big bads, and it feels different. These Archfiends very much feel like a similar setup with that. Now, I also said way back on the Orcs that there's a table for generating the demon that Orc had defeated. I wish they at least mentioned going back to that table, because if you want that Archfiend to have minions, they made the tables for it. It's just not in the Archfiend section. Between those 2 tools, you have everything you need for all kinds of demons and a big bad and generals. And like I said, you can easily run 5 to 6 campaigns, each with a different big bad. But then there's D20 tables for different motivations and different goals, which means you can have the big bad come back and have a totally different game plan this time. There are so many campaigns built into this that is just amazing. Now with this, we're going to bleed into what I feel was lacking, because when it comes to that, I want to bring up what I feel like is the most lacking. Now, my friend who introduced me to this book did some more digging and found out there's something coming, but there's no bestiary in this book. There's the stats, like there's a core Archfiend stat, and then each Archfiend has modifiers to that core stat, so you build the Archfiend. And there's a couple mentions here and there, but there's not really monsters in this book. And because of the different hit point system, I feel like there should have been at least a handful in this book to make it truly playable. There is a bestiary coming as part of the Kickstarter. Like I said, I wish they just had like a handful of baddies, maybe like give me some like bandits or raiders, give me whatever your version of goblins or kobolds are, something low level so I can wrap stuff together, or give us a sample adventure in the back. I'd love even more. But that's one short side or downside to the book. The other thing I feel like it's kind of lacking is this book does have feats, but I don't love them. There's some interesting feats, and there's one I feel like actually the requirements are necessary, but I don't know if it's on par with 5th edition feats. There's a paladin feat that basically lets you become an anti-paladin. Why don't you just take anti-paladin? But it lets your divine damage become necrotic damage. You can heal or harm with your lay on hands, blah, blah, blah. Again, there's a lot of feats that are prerequisite class. And when you look into how 5th edition's built, if it's specific to a class, it should have been a class option. But even worse, there's a few of those feats where you look, and there's one like Survivor. And the feat lets you take 2 survival actions in the survival phase. Cool. I don't know if that's really worth the actual punch of a feat in 5e. They're written kind of like 3.5 feats. But it's also limited to rangers. Well, why didn't you just make a ranger subclass if that was their thing? Because realistically, someone being a survivor should be a feat anyone can take in this type of setting. Or there's a fighter feat that literally is just you kind of have like a different stance. And it's like, okay, there's nothing that says only fighters should ever be able to take this other than you putting fighter as a prerequisite. I think the feat section is lacking. I feel like most of the feats are balanced as like 3rd/3/5 feats, which 5th edition feats have a lot more punch to them. And then on top of that, a lot of them have class restrictions that they really shouldn't need to. The only one that I see absolutely would have to go to a class is the paladin, because it's based on lay on hands. But at the same time, you're basically just saying, here's a feat to become an anti-paladin, rather than just taking Oathbreaker, or make a necrotic paladin, because you didn't give paladin a subclass. And I get that's more work, but that fits in the design philosophies of this edition. These don't. So they don't really fit as well as everything else. But honestly, that's a small gripe compared to what's in this book. So seriously, check it out. It's Ravaged Wasteland, of a name I can't pronounce. If you notice, I didn't pronounce the names of the Archfiends. They do all have names, but they're just as hard to pronounce. Dig this book up. Grab it on PDF. If you have the money, grab it on print. I believe they're still working on the print for the Kickstarter, so I don't believe it's available print on demand yet. But my friend who got this book, who introduced me to this book, wasn't part of the Kickstarter. I'm not part of the Kickstarter, so anybody can go grab it. Check it out. I'll catch you guys next time. Bye. Hey guys, so this is a custom outro video, because if you notice, some of this video was different if you're a returning viewer. I'm not on the new rig yet, but I'm still experimenting with some stuff on my old rig, so that's why some of the transitions were choppy. I'm sorry about that. The new rig coming in a few months means editing's going to be faster and smoother. Down below, you'll see our producers and executive producers. Those are the people down at Patreon. I want to thank all of them. I really need to update that list. On top of that, I'm going to throw up some links to videos if you are new to this. And check out the GM table .com. We got a website up. It's got a store. Honestly, it's having some issues, but check it out. There's some awesome shirts and buttons and hats that are going on. So if it works for you, cool. We're still buffing that stuff out. We got some other cool stuff coming. We got some channels that we're going to announce. We got some podcasts we're going to announce. All that great new big stuff coming for the new year. But for now, this is what we got. I'll catch you guys later. Bye.